Hi, this is Professor Tafuro, and this is your first video lecture. Here we're looking at Chapter 1 from your text, titled Language Development and Introduction. So we're going to start off by just kind of giving an overview of each of the sections. So I want you to understand that the study of language development generally explores how children acquire language, and it's influenced by many factors, different factors, things not only like the language that they learn, but also influenced by interactions they have with caregivers. So despite so many different studies, we do have a lot of unanswered questions. It's a pretty complex field, but the chapter overall covers topics on things that we know really, really well, like not only how we're defining language, but also how we're studying it in terms of its different domains or features in particular. So we're going to spend some time defining language. So by definition, language is a system of symbols. Those symbols can be in the form of phonemes or morphemes. Morphemes are a unit of meaning. And the symbols, those morphemes, they can be spoken or they can be written, and they are combined together to create words which represent different aspects of the world, different ideas. So the relationship between words, those symbols, and their reference are very much arbitrary, meaning that there's nothing very flowerish about a flower. We call it a flower, but it's a completely arbitrary symbol for that object. An example of a non-arbitrary symbol would be calling a creature that barks a woof, because the woof sounds like the bark, right? That's non-arbitrary. But calling a house is very arbitrary. All of our words, the majority of the words that we use, are very arbitrary. But what's not arbitrary are how we organize those words into sentences. They have to follow very, very specific rules. Okay? So language is then a conventional system of symbols. It's shared by community. It allows for the expression of communication and the understanding of others' ideas. We can also say that language is very dynamic in that it changes over time. It changes both within individuals, so how I use language might change based on my setting or my age. I sound a little bit differently now than I did 20 years ago. But it also changes in terms of communities. We see how new words and usages emerge over time. I mean, we've seen this just sometimes within months. The words that, say, you guys are using are new and different, and words that I don't necessarily know what the meanings are. So this very dynamic nature, coupled with its symbolic nature, makes language a really powerful and unique human tool for human communication. And that's really the main message there. We want to talk about how language is also a cognitive tool. It's different from cognition, but it can be sort of organized or talked about as a cognitive tool because it aids in thinking and communication. But I would say early on it emerged as a social tool, is the message being shared here, because it was really about facilitating communication within communities. But it later evolved as a representational tool to help with higher level thinking and cognitive processes, say like reasoning or problem solving. The human brain is very good at using language for storing information and also for executing very complex cognitive tasks. So again, if we think about language, we want to think about it as a distinctly different process, albeit one that supports cognition. Okay. We also can understand and think about how language theorists have proposed that the human brain contains very specialized modules. And those modules, let's see, make sure I'm on the right page here. Yeah, so we understand that language modules, if you will, are specific parts of the brain that process very specific linguistic information. So, studies of individuals with brain damage or children and families actually with specific language impairment um, are how we support this notion, because we've seen how very distinct brain regions that are damaged might maybe impact grammar or verb structure differently from, say, how we understand or produce words. Okay. But this, of course, is really in contrast, in a way, right, to those critics who argue that that language has emerged from a purely cultural, or as a purely cultural influence. And they argue that language is processed by general neural networks. And they believe that the research does lack evidence for very language-specific modules. And I would say that today, the thinking is that we are somewhere in between the two. So like we talked about in Psychology of Language, for those of you who have taken that course already, the idea is that we have these networks. So it's not really just in a single location or module, and it's not totally domain general across the brain globally, but we have networks of pathways that are involved in language processing to different extents. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about how, if we back up for a moment here, I guess on the bottom of this page, language is a little bit different from speech, hearing, and communication. We want to make sure we highlight that. So as an example, language, as we said, is a rule-governed system used to represent thoughts, and it happens neurologically. There's neuro-linguistic pathways. That means language is located in the brain. But speech, on the other hand, is a neuromuscular or neuromotor process, okay? And that's how we produce sounds. And this is an image, figure 1.1, of the neuromotor system. Communication, on the other hand, involves sharing information between two or more, right? Conveying information between two or more people. And that is a very different concept, because communication can occur non-verbally, for example. Okay? So we want to understand that speech production likely emerged somewhere between, 50,000 years ago to 150,000 years ago. It seems to have an advantage communicatively over gestures, and the basic model of speech production, as it's understood today, includes a perceptual level where mental representations are created, so ideas and images that we have, that at the second level are eventually planned. And thirdly, then they become speech output. So we can see that the perceptual leads to what we call a motor schema, right? Which is a rough motor plan that organizes phonemes and sounds into syllables. And then those are sent to the major muscle groups for speech output. So this motor schema is somewhere between the muscular movement and the thought process, the mental representations of sounds. And it's sort of the planning for the motor pathway. Okay, and that's important for you to understand. So overall, we can definitely say that speech is a complex neuromotor behavior, and it can be used to share language, but language, again, is independent from speech. And while speech relies on language for meaning, language can be shared through other means, right? Such as writing or formal signing. And we do have individuals with different disabilities where, despite having language skills, they might struggle to communicate. Let's say someone with a cerebral palsy. So you might have a language system intact neurolinguistically speaking, but you don't have the motor, neuromotor pathway to produce speech. And that's just a great way of understanding how speech and language are distinctly different. We're not going to get too much into hearing. You know that hearing or the word audition involves the perception or perceiving sound, which is a little different or can be categorized as perceiving speech, but also perceiving non-speech sounds, right? So we also can think about the different levels at which speech takes place. You don't have to worry about that too much, though. Just know that the brain does differentiate between general auditory information and speech sounds, right? Because the speech sounds are processed through very specialized mechanisms, and that's important to understand. Okay, and finally this section ends with a discussion about communication and talks about how communication can be, again, we have to have a sender and a receiver, so conveying of information to more people. But the idea of communication is also that it can be pre-intentional, developmentally speaking anyway, that it can be pre-intentional or intentional, right? Intentional is a bit more precise. Intentional communication is communicating something with meaning, oftentimes symbolically. So using words as symbols, where we have a clear relationship between what is being communicated and how, and the word being used to communicate. So again, I say phone, and I mean specifically the object that you use and hold to your ear. Okay? So we want to sort of understand that generally communication is this dynamic, active system that requires information, again, including both the sender and the receiver, engaging the sender and the receiver. Feedback is really important, and it happens both linguistically and non-linguistically in communication. And it's really important for maintaining the flow and the effective communication. So imagine the difference between texting somebody something and then you don't hear anything versus saying that same something to somebody in front of their face and then you get to see their reaction, and that is an example of non-linguistic feedback, so that it helps you to decide what to say next, right? So it keeps the communication loop moving and keeps communication effective. This decontextualized communication, where you don't have access to that feedback, makes communication very, very challenging. And that's something I think we're all very familiar with these days. Okay, so keeping in mind that communication involves sharing information and obtaining feedback to avoid any kind of breakdown. Okay, so moving on to the major components of language, we want to make sure that we're understanding form, content, and use generally. Okay, those are the three domains of language. So form refers to how words or sentences, and also sounds, are organized or structured or follow rules, and that's how they convey meaning. Okay, whereas form is also focused on how we examine those structures in order to make sure that those structures are communicating what it is we're meaning to communicate. So, for example, applying a past tense, ed, is a structure that we apply because we're talking about something during a time that's already passed. In contrast, we have the idea of content, right? And content focuses on the meaning of language. And in this example, we're really highlighting the use of concrete and contextualized vocabulary. So that's with, I believe, I forget the little girl's name, Adelaide actually, right? So if you read through this example, it helps you to understand how the content is really focused on the meaning of her language and highlighting how her vocabulary is used in very context-specific ways. Whereas use, the third element, considers the functional aspect of Adelaide's language, so such as how interactions or personal intentions are what really guide her utterances. Okay, so the text then goes on to divide these three elements into 5 main components: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And these are really important for us to know. So a page ago or so, we introduced phonology, which deals with sounds and their variations. Here we have morphology, by definition focusing on word structure and meaning of these units of combined sounds. We also have syntax, which governs sentence structure, and semantics, which we know is concerned with total word or phrase meaning. And pragmatics finally involves language use in different social contexts. And that here we have that talked about. So that's an introduction to those 5 components. And chapter 2 goes into some distinct differences between them, among them rather, and really does a much deeper dive. So you'll look closely at those elements when we get to chapter 2. But finally, we want to talk about, I love this last section, what are some of the remarkable features of language, because I think that it would be very difficult to argue that the acquisition rate, or the rate at which, the speed with which young children acquire language, isn't absolutely remarkable. If you think about it, there's so many things that we can't do by 3 years old, yet we can engage in, fully grammatically correct and meaningful sentences talking about all sorts of things, whether it's knowledge we learned or feelings and opinions that we have. So really very interesting to think about how quickly we acquire language. There's also this idea that there's a critical period for language development, similar to that of other species, actually. And it's this critical period hypothesis that really does speak to universality of language development, because it's saying that as long as we're exposed to language within this period of time, up until including puberty, the idea is that language development happens across the species as long as there's no pathology. And the reason would be because we have this sort of shared cognitive and linguistic infrastructure across all cultures. So it's a very universal human trait. Okay, so that kind of speaks to the idea, again, I'll just sort of clarify. Universality is the idea that every human culture has a language, right? It's across all cultures, but it's also very specific to our species because of our cognitive infrastructure and linguistic infrastructure. And then I would say that finally, this idea of semanticity, if you will, it's the idea that we are able to talk at length and in great detail about elements that are decontextualized. So in other words, semanticity is the idea that we can use these arbitrary symbols to talk about things that are not in the current here or now. That's what displacement means. We can talk about what happened 2 weeks ago. We can talk about what we want to do 2 months from now. We can talk about what happens around the corner in a restaurant that we've been to but we're not currently in right now. That's the idea of semanticity. And finally, the idea of productivity, okay, which you can see here describes, another word that we often hear is the notion of generative language. So it's just the idea that we're generating or producing combinations of a small number of discrete units, and then we combine them into, we have this finite set of discrete units, let's say in English 42 phonemes. but we can combine them in an infinite number we can combine them in so many ways that we can create an infinite number of words, really, and then use those words to express ourselves. So that's the idea of productivity. Okay, so I'm at 20 minutes, going to keep each of these videos limited to 20 minutes. So we do a quick overview and make sure that you've answered all of the interactive items for this assignment. And please email with any questions.